Okay, we're now going to go to 10.0, which are action items. And at this time, we have our second reading on 10.1 for policy ADC, tobacco-free school district. And we're going to go ahead and get the first motion. Let's go ahead and get the first motion on the floor. We'll open it up for discussion, and then we'll do the subsequent motions. Is that okay with you? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So do I hear a motion to approve policy ADC, tobacco-free school district, for second reading?
Madam Chair, I move that we approve policy ADC, tobacco-free school district, as provided by administration.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Anderson. Okay, we now have a motion and a second on the floor. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Caldwell so he can update us on this, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments from the board. Mr. Caldwell?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, Dr. Little. You will remember that in November, I brought to you first reading of a policy that you updated and approved in July. So we've spent several months talking about tobacco and nicotine-free schools. There are three policies that I'm bringing forward tonight. If you'll also remember that all three policies have the exact same language, so if I'm speaking of one, I'm actually speaking of three. I can say this three times, or I can kind of combine it as talk about all three policies.
Let's go ahead and talk about all three, and then what we'll do, we'll subsequently do the other two.
Well, again, the policies are ADC, which is tobacco and nicotine-free school district. Policy GBED, tobacco and nicotine-free workplace, and policy JICG, which is tobacco and nicotine use by students. I presented some edits, some amendments for first reading in November, and since that time, we've made some additional edits. For example, under the board commitments, we added to the bullet about maintaining 100% tobacco and nicotine-free environment unless the person is in a prescribed tobacco cessation program, because we're learning that is probably going to be more and more common. One of the questions that was asked, I believe, of Ms. Green in the November meeting was she had received feedback about the staff consequences, and folks were looking for a more standard way of administering those. In talking with HR, it turns out that their Code of Excellence already addresses this. So they have a first, second, third, and fourth offense. And so what I've added, I've stricken the old language from the staff consequences and added exactly what is reflected in the Code of Excellence for human resources. Those are really the major changes that we've made since the first reading of these three policies. So I'll open it up to any questions you may have.
Okay.
Actually, before they ask a question, Mr. Caldwell, can you just walk us through the reasoning behind the student punishments?
Sure. They
Or
originally,
consequences, I shouldn't say punishments. I'm sorry, I'm using wrong language there.
consequences.
The consequences, yes, sir.
The policy that was adopted in June or in July had for first offense a 1-day suspension and second offense up to 3-day suspension, which was consistent with the old policy from June of 2019 back. We, as a district, have started taking a much more therapeutic approach to our discipline. We do realize that it is punitive by nature, but the goal is to change behavior, and simply a simple punishment doesn't always get that. So instead of having a first offense suspension, out of school suspension, it is a one day in school suspension, and the student will be required to complete an online tobacco vaping cessation program while in school. Along with that goes the item will be confiscated and not returned. There will be administrative conference with the parents. There is a referral to law enforcement because that's what the law mandates. And then it was omitted last time, but I've added back the suspension from the extracurricular activities. Second offense, instead of an out-of-school suspension, it's going to be 6 hours of community service at the school where the student is enrolled. Also, a much more involved cessation program through a RAID Act will be a requirement that the students fulfill, along with the law enforcement and the conference and those things. The third offense, we went very strong. So if you read it on paper, it looks very punitive because our third offense is a recommendation for expulsion. The reason for that, however, is still therapeutic in nature, because we would like to think that at that point, a student would go through the expulsion process, but that may give them an opportunity to go to our alternative educational services, where they could have an even more detailed hands-on therapeutic approach, much like we do the students with our drug and alcohol offenses.
Board, are there any questions or comments regarding these three policies?
Yes, Ms. Smith, I'd like to ask, I guess maybe my colleagues that are of the medical profession, in the statement that was added that says, unless the person is in a prescribed tobacco cessation program, do we need to specify a physician-prescribed tobacco cessation program or doctor? I'm just wondering if we need to make that a little bit narrower, so it's not just, Uncle Joe prescribed this cessation program, so I've got to wear this. I don't know if it's necessary or if it's presumed.
Well, it was presumed by us, because when I see the word prescribed, I think of a medical prescription, but to your point, it could be someone who is not a licensed provider prescribing some sort of program, I assume.
Yeah, me too, but doesn't always happen. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. I think some of the cessation programs may be ultimately ran by potentially a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, but at the end of the day, there is a MD sign-off on that. So you're probably safe to say, unless a person is in a physician-prescribed tobacco cessation program, that's probably, if you use the word medically, now that I think about it, medically might be loose for interpretation. Probably physician prescribed. What do you think, Brent?
I think license.
Yeah.
License would cover it, because then you'd be licensed by a state entity as a provider. So a licensed provider would cover that concern, because then you can't be,
Right,
boutique
because that's what
shop.
I'm thinking, sometimes with stuff like this, if there's wiggle room,
Yep,
people
yep.
will find wiggle room to,
So if the
So
person is in a tobacco cessation program prescribed by a licensed physician,
Licensed provider,
licensed
Yeah.
provider.
because then that picks up PAs, nurse practitioners.
do we need to make a
So,
motion to
yeah.
change that language?
Because this is the final reading, correct? I mean, okay. So I think, Anne Marie, you're making a motion.
Yes, to add by a licensed provider to the end of that sentence.
Okay,
So we have a motion to amend. I'll second it.
okay. And we now have a motion to amend. We have a second. Let me put that down, Green. Powers on the amendment. Are there any questions or comments regarding that amendment? Hearing none, we'll take a vote. All in favor of that amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The amendment passes. It carries 7-0. It's
For all
unanimous.
And that,
three
again, that
policies.
amendment will be
Yeah,
for
well-
all three policies.
Yes, amended for
We'll
all
do,
three.
we'll do each, because we've got them, we're already separating them out. So we now have amended the policy. So, or is there any other discussion before we take a vote on the policy as amended?
Yeah, suspension from extracurricular activities for the day, open to, I guess, athletic code, open to band director, open to, I mean, I understand the policy has to be loose to allow for some freedom in there, but at the same time, what does it mean? Is it just for that day, or is it ...
Well, when it was an out-of-school suspension, it was for the time that the student was suspended
Okay.
from school. So now that we don't have an out-of-school suspension, excuse me, it is at this point open to interpretation, but I will tell you, we've already begun meeting with David Bennett and the coaches and the high school principals to kind of have a consistent application of that.
Okay. And then I could see one question coming up where we allow for 4 infractions by staff, but only 3 by students. From an HR implication, is it more just to maintain consistency with what's currently in place for staff?
The reason there's 4 is because I lifted that directly from the Code of Excellence from HR. That's correct.
Okay. And again, from the sort of remedying side of this, does the health insurance offer to staff, is there a nicotine cessation program for staff? Or is it, anybody know?
And I do not know the
It
answer to
seems
that.
like I remember that somewhere, but I can't swear to it, but I do believe that they do. There are, I know they do with nicotine. I mean, they do the, what's the drug that they use now to quit smoking?
Nicorette?
Oh,
Chantix, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they pay for that.
Okay. I guess the only thought there being that, again, along with that same line of, you're really trying to encourage people to quit and to give them resource for that. If the health insurance or something similar doesn't provide for that, is there similar programming that can become available through LORADAC or something? I don't think there has to be a policy change regarding this, but just more of a consideration.
The state health plan does have a Quit for Life program available at no charge
Okay, good.
to anyone 13 or old, dependents 13 or older as well.
Okay, great. And I guess the only other consideration, I know how much work you guys have put into the policy, and I think it's pretty tight. I think it's important because it kind of hit me at 2 o'clock in the morning. We're dealing after the fact. So the infraction has already occurred. So how do we get to the prevention side? Are we trying to say that deterrence is going to be enough? Or, how do we address that moving forward? And again, this is not directly related to policy. It's more of application of the policy and will it be enough? So I would kind of really, oftentimes we make policy and we kind of archive it, and the conversation dies. And what I can tell you is that big corporations rely on the ADD of our culture and the fact that we have a very forgetful attitude a lot of times. And this is still going to be a problem 2 months from now, still going to be a problem 6 months from now, probably a year from now. So I would kind of encourage maybe some monthly data, coming back to us of saying, hey, these are what our rates look like. This is how it comparatively looks to last year. We've made this policy change. Has it changed anything with regard to behavior? I've oftentimes found students to be, quite frankly, the best problem solvers you will ever have. I can still remember doing my soil conservation essay as a 5th grader. And so, kind of putting this back to the students and saying, hey, there's a problem here, guys, and we need your help figuring it out. And then, I got some feedback from the community, just curious about staff education. It's just such a changing, it's a moving target. So how are we addressing proactively, I guess, is the bigger question there.
Well, through education, we can continue to have those conversations with Dr. Talley's team. I will tell you, we are participating in a webinar tomorrow, we being some folks in student services, that may give us some best practices as far as not only the recognition, but the training of staff, because, they're doing it in the locker rooms, in the bathrooms, and in the back of English class. So we're kind of relying on the experts in the field to continue to train us, and then we take that information out to the administrators, who then carry it to the teachers. So that's how that matriculates.
Any other questions or comments, board? Okay, let's see, we have a motion and a second with an amendment on this policy, so we'll now take a vote. We're still on policy ADC, which is tobacco-free school district. And so all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries with the amendment, and it is unanimous. Okay, we'll now go to the second reading of policy GBED, tobacco-free workplace. Do I hear a motion to approve policy GBED, tobacco-free workplace, for the second reading?
Madam Chair, I move that we approve policy GBED, tobacco-free workplace, as proposed by administration.
Okay, we have a motion by Ms. Green. Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, we now have a second on the floor. And let's see, this Powers. Okay, and I don't think, do we need to discuss this further, Mr. Caldwell, or did you already discuss this one?
It's really the same thing throughout. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
and at this time, I think we want to amend it. So, Ms. Green?
Yes, ma'am. I'd like to make a motion to amend this to add by a licensed provider at the end of this sentence that we discussed earlier.
Thank you. We now have an amendment on the floor as submitted by Ms. Green. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Powers. We now have an amendment and a second. Amendment with a motion and a second. Are there any questions or comments regarding that amendment? Hearing none, we'll take a vote on the amendment. So all those in favor of the amendment, adding the words licensed provider to this policy, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries, and it is unanimous. So we now have an amended policy, so we're going to go back. Are there any questions or comments regarding the policy as amended before we do the final vote? Okay, hearing none, we'll take a final vote. All those in favor of approving policy GBED, tobacco-free workplace, as amended with the words licensed provider, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The motion carries, and it is once again unanimous. We'll now go to policy JICG, tobacco use by students. Do I hear a motion to approve policy JICG, tobacco use by students, for second reading?
Madam Chair, I move that we approve policy JICG, tobacco use by students, as proposed by administration.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. We now have a second. And so, are there any questions or comments regarding the policy before we bring up the amendment? Okay. Do I have an amendment to that policy?
Yes, ma'am. I would like to propose that we amend the statement that we did previously to add the words by a licensed provider.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. Are there any questions or comments regarding the amendment? Hearing none, we will take a vote on the amendment as submitted by Ms. Green to add the words licensed provider. All those in favor of that amendment, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries, and it is unanimous. So we now have an amended policy. Are there any questions or comments before we take the final vote on that policy? Hearing none, we are going to vote on policy JICG, tobacco use as amended. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries, and it is unanimous. And thank you, Mr. Caldwell, because that's a lot of work. And, you know, we just went to a school board conference, and Ms. Green went before the legislative body and was stressing to them how concerned we are about vaping and what this epidemic in our schools. So this board is very concerned with that. So we appreciate you bringing all these to our attention.
Thank you.